They say the higher you fly, the harder you fall. Meet Richard Dalton, a man who thought he had it all: the CEO title, the private jet lifestyle, and a brand new younger mistress on his arm. He thought his boring ex-wife Audrey was just a stepping stone he'd successfully discarded in the trash. But tonight, at the most exclusive aviation gala of the decade, Richard is about to learn a brutal lesson in humility. He thinks he's walking in as the king of the world, but he has no idea that the woman he betrayed holds the keys to his entire kingdom. Fasten your seatbelts. This isn't just a breakup. It's a total teardown. The air inside the blistering exclusivity of the Teterboro Airport private terminal smelled of expensive espresso and even more expensive leather. It was a scent Richard Dalton had grown addicted to over the last 5 years. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit, checking his reflection in the darkened glass of the lounge. At 45, Richard looked the part of a Titan silver fox hair, perfectly coiffed, a jawline that suggested stubbornness, and a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than most people's homes. "Rick, baby, stop looking at yourself and look at me," a voice purred from the plush armchair behind him. Richard turned, a smirk playing on his lips. Bella Sinclair sat there, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone. She was 24, a vision in a tight red designer dress that screamed new money. She was the prize Richard had awarded himself after finally finalizing his divorce from Audrey 3 weeks ago. "I'm just making sure the suit fits the occasion, Bella," Richard said, walking over and taking a sip of his scotch. "Tonight isn't just a party. The Skyward Gala in Zurich is where the board announces the new global managing partner. That position is mine. I've earned it." Bella looked up, eyes sparkling with avarice. "And once your partner, we get the house in the Hamptons. The one with the private dock. We get the house, the boat, and the world, babe." Richard promised, leaning down to kiss her. He felt a surge of triumph. For 15 years he had been married to Audrey. Audrey who wore sensible shoes. Audrey who preferred staying in with a book rather than networking at high-profile dinners. Audrey whose father she claimed was a retired mechanic from Ohio. She was sweet, supportive, and utterly suffocating to a man of Richard's ambition. When he filed for divorce, he had been ruthless. He hid assets, undervalued his stock options, and convinced her to settle for a meager alimony payment just to get it over with. She had signed the papers with tears in her eyes, murmuring something about hoping money makes you happy. It does, Richard thought. It really does. "Mr. Dalton." A concierge approached, holding a tablet. "Your Gulfstream G650 is being prepped. However, there has been a slight change in the manifest. The board has requested that several VIP shareholders share the cabin for the flight to Zurich." Richard frowned, his ego bristling. "Excuse me, I chartered this flight through the company account. I expected privacy." "I understand, sir," the concierge said, his face impassive. "But as the Skyward Gala is a company-wide event, the chairman authorized the consolidation of flights for sustainability purposes. You'll be joined by 2 other parties." Richard waved a hand dismissively. "Fine, whatever. As long as they stay out of my way and don't drink all the Dom Perignon." "Who are they, middle management?" "I don't have the full manifest visible here, sir. Just security clearance codes." The concierge lied smoothly. Or perhaps he just didn't care. "Rick, this is annoying," Bella whined, standing up and grabbing her Louis Vuitton carry-on. "I wanted to join the Mile High Club in peace." "Relax," Richard whispered harshly. "If shareholders are on board, I need to look like a leader, not a frat boy. Play the part of the future CEO's wife, got it?" Bella rolled her eyes, but nodded. Fiancé. Soon to be. Let's go. They walked out onto the tarmac, the wind whipping Bella's hair. The jet was a sleek silver beast, the pinnacle of luxury aviation. Richard felt that familiar rush of power. This was his domain. As they reached the stairs, a black Lincoln Navigator pulled up to the adjacent spot. The door opened, and an older man stepped out. He was dressed in a suit that looked older than he was, tweed and slightly ill-fitting, leaning heavily on a cane. Richard paused on the stairs, looking down. He recognized the man vaguely some low-level investor he'd seen at annual meetings, usually hovering near the buffet. George Jeffrey. Something like that. But it was the woman who stepped out after him that made Richard freeze. She was wearing a trench coat, a scarf wrapped around her head, and oversized sunglasses covering her face. She looked small, unassuming. She moved to the trunk to help the driver with a battered leather suitcase. "Hey!" Richard shouted over the wind, his voice dripping with condescension. "You two leave the bags for the ground crew, and try to hurry up, we have a slot to hit." The woman froze. She turned slowly. Even with the sunglasses, the posture was familiar. "Rick," Bella asked, tugging his arm. "Who are the old guy and the maid?" "Just freeloaders," Richard muttered. "Probably won a company raffle to get a seat on the jet." The woman downstairs didn't respond. She simply took the older man's arm and guided him toward the stairs. As they climbed, Richard blocked the doorway, forcing them to stop on the step below him. "Let's get one thing clear," Richard said, his voice low but sharp. "I'm Richard Dalton, Senior VP of North American Operations. I'm working on this flight. I don't want chatter, I don't want requests for selfies, and I definitely don't want you disturbing my guest. Sit in the back. Stay quiet." The older man looked up. His eyes a piercing, watery blue. He didn't look intimidated. He looked amused. "We wouldn't dream of disturbing you, Mr. Dalton," the old man said. His voice was raspy but clear. "We have plenty of work to do ourselves." The woman kept her head down, brushing past Richard without a word. As she passed, Richard caught a scent, lavender and old paper. His stomach dropped. That was Audrey's scent. He whipped his head around, staring at the back of her head as she took a seat in the rear of the cabin, facing away from him. "No," he told himself, shaking his head. "Audrey is in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, crying over her cat. She's not on a private jet to Zurich." "Rick, you look like you've seen a ghost." Bella laughed, flopping onto the cream-colored leather divan. "Just thought I recognized someone," Richard muttered, taking his seat opposite Bella. "Doesn't matter. Let's get a drink." He signaled the flight attendant, ignoring the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. He was Richard Dalton. He was untouchable, and tonight was his night. The Gulf Stream reached cruising altitude smoothly, the cabin quiet, save for the soft clinking of crystal. Richard had downed 2 glasses of scotch in rapid succession, trying to wash away the strange anxiety that the woman in the back had triggered. He glanced over his shoulder. The older man was asleep, a newspaper draped over his chest. The woman was reading a thick file, her face still obscured by the angle of the seat, and a large hat she hadn't removed. "You're obsessed with them," Bella noted, picking at a plate of smoked salmon the stewardess had brought. "Is it the old guy? Is he someone important?" "Hardly." Richard scoffed loud enough for the cabin to hear. "Looks like a retired actuary. Probably counted beans for 40 years and got a pity invite to the gala." He stretched his legs out. "So let's talk about the acceptance speech. I'm thinking of starting with a joke about the competition, then pivoting to visionary leadership. really sell the idea that without me, the North American sector would have collapsed. Bella giggled. You're so bad. But what about her? Richard stiffened. Who? Your ex, Audrey. Does she know you're getting the promotion? Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound. Audrey doesn't know anything about my world, Bella. That was the problem. She was small. Small-minded, small dreams. She was happy knitting and watching documentaries. I needed someone who could stand next to a CEO. Someone like you. He saw the woman in the back stiffen. Her hand paused over the file she was reading. Richard, emboldened by the alcohol and his own arrogance, continued. Honestly, I did her a favor. She would have been eaten alive at a gala like this. Can you imagine Audrey in Zurich? She'd probably show up in a cardigan and ask the waiters for recipes. It was embarrassing. Bella smirked. Well, you upgraded. Clearly. Mr. Dalton. A calm voice cut through the air. Richard jumped. The woman from the back was standing in the aisle. She had removed her hat and sunglasses. Richard's glass slipped from his hand, bouncing onto the carpeted floor with a dull thud. It was Audrey. But it wasn't the Audrey he remembered. The frumpy clothes were gone. She was wearing a tailored black jumpsuit that screamed quiet luxury. Her hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun, was blown out in sleek waves. But it was her eyes that were different. They weren't soft and pleading anymore. They were cold. Steel. Audrey, Richard choked out. What the hell are you doing here? Bella looked between them, confused. Wait. This is the ex-wife. The librarian. Audrey didn't look at Bella. Her gaze was fixed entirely on Richard. Hello, Richard. I believe you were just telling your companion about how embarrassing I am. Richard scrambled to regain his composure. He stood up, smoothing his jacket, trying to physically tower over her. I asked you a question. What are you doing on this plane? Are you stalking me? Did you use my name to get on this flight? He turned to the flight attendant who was hovering nearby. Janice, get security on the comms. I want this woman removed as soon as we land. She's a trespasser. I wouldn't do that, Richard, the older man said. He was awake now, folding his newspaper calmly. You stay out of this, old man, Richard snapped. This is a domestic dispute. He turned back to Audrey, his face turning red. You think you can just crash my big night? You think you can embarrass me in front of the board? I'm not here to embarrass you, Richard, Audrey said smoothly, taking a step closer. I'm here to attend the gala. You, at the Skyward Gala. Richard laughed incredulously. As what waitstaff? Did you get a job catering? Audrey smiled. It was a terrifying smile. Something like that. Look, Richard hissed, lowering his voice. I know you're bitter about the settlement. I know you think you deserve more. But following me to Zurich is psychotic. If you sit down, shut up, and sign an ND, a promising never to come near me again, I won't have you arrested when we land. I'll even give you enough cash to fly commercial back home. Bella chimed in, looking Audrey up and down with distaste. Yeah, honey. Take the deal. You really don't fit in here. Audrey looked at Bella for the first time. Her expression wasn't angry. It was pitying. You must be Bella. Richard has a type. Young, ambitious, and easily impressed by least assets. Excuse me. Bella stood up, furious. Sit down, Bella, Audrey commanded. The authority in her voice was so absolute that Bella actually sat looking stunned. Audrey turned back to Richard. I'm not signing anything, Richard, and I'm certainly not flying commercial. I suggest you enjoy the rest of the flight. It's going to be a very long night for you. She turned and walked back to her seat, sitting next to the old man. Richard stood there shaking. He felt a mix of rage and confusion. How did she get on the plane? Who paid for her ticket? He stormed over to the flight attendant, Gala. Janice, he whispered furiously, who authorized her boarding pass? I want a name. Janice, a veteran flight attendant who had served Richard for years, looked uncomfortable. She glanced toward the back of the plane, then back at Richard. Mr. Dalton, I really can't say. The manifest is sealed by the holding company. The holding company. Richard frowned. Sterling and Company. Why would the parent company care about my ex-wife? I don't know, sir, but the gentleman with her. That's Mr. Arthur. Arthur. Richard racked his brain. Arthur, who I don't know any Arthurs in the C-suite. I don't know his last name, sir, but the pilot called him the Admiral. Richard snorted. Great. She's dating a senile veteran. That's her speed. He walked back to his seat, pouring himself a third drink. Don't worry about it, Bella, he said, though his hand was trembling slightly. She's trying to psych me out. It's a desperate ploy. She's probably sleeping with that old guy for a taste of the high life. Bella looked unsure. Rick, she didn't look desperate. She looked expensive. It's a costume, Richard insisted, downing the scotch. Smoke and mirrors. When we get to the Gala, security will toss her out. I guarantee it. The plane began its descent into Zurich. Outside the window, the Swiss Alps rose like jagged teeth. Richard stared at them, trying to suppress the gnawing dread in his gut. He was Richard Dalton. He was the future CEO. Nothing could stop him. But as the wheels touched down on the tarmac, and he saw a fleet of black SUVs waiting specifically near the rear of the plane's exit, he realized that the turbulence was only just beginning. The landing gear of the Gulfstream G650 locked into place with a mechanical thud that reverberated through the cabin floor. To Richard Dalton, it sounded like a gavel striking a block, a final judgment he couldn't quite interpret yet. As the plane taxied across the freezing tarmac of Zurich Airport, the sun was setting behind the Alps, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the snow. Richard unbuckled his seatbelt the moment the fasten seatbelt sign pinged off, eager to reassert his dominance. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, and turned to Bella. Check your makeup, he ordered, his voice tight. When that door opens, there might be press. The Swiss trade journals cover arrivals for the Skyward Gala. I need you looking perfect. Bella pulled out a compact mirror, dabbing at her lipstick. I always look perfect, Rick. You're the one sweating. He was sweating. Despite the climate-controlled cabin, a thin film of perspiration had broken out on his forehead. He wiped it away angrily. It was just the scotch. It had to be. The cabin door hissed open, revealing the biting cold air of Switzerland. Richard grabbed his briefcase and moved to the exit, intending to be the first one down the stairs. It was a subtle power move. He always employed the leader leads. But as he stepped into the aisle, a large, uniformed man blocked his path. It was the head of the flight crew. One moment, Mr. Dalton, the steward said, his tone polite but physically unyielding. We have a priority disembarkation protocol. Richard's face flushed. Priority, I am the priority. I'm the Senior VP of North American Operations. Instructions from the ground, sir, the steward said, looking past Richard. He nodded toward the back of the plane. Mr. Arthur and Miss Audrey, if you please. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. He watched, paralyzed, as Audrey helped her father stand. The old man Arthur moved slowly, his cane tapping rhythmically on the floor. As they passed Richard, the confined space forced them into proximity. Audrey paused. She looked at Richard not with anger, but with a detached curiosity, as if he were an exhibit in a museum she had lost interest in. "After you," Richard spat sarcastically, stepping aside into the galley kitchenette to let them pass. "Thank you, Richard," Audrey said softly. "Manners matter even in business." She guided her father to the door. As they stepped out onto the metal stairs, Richard craned his neck to see what was happening on the tarmac. His jaw unhinged. Waiting at the bottom of the stairs wasn't the usual luxury shuttle bus. It was a fleet of vehicles arranged in a phalanx. In the center sat a vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom 6, the kind reserved for royalty and heads of state, flanked by 2 black Range Rovers with diplomatic flags on the hoods. A team of security guards in earpieces swarmed the stairs. 2 of them immediately took the battered leather suitcase from Arthur's hand, treating it like it contained nuclear codes. A chauffeur in a grey uniform actually bowed, as he opened the rear door of the Rolls-Royce. "What is this?" Bella whispered, peering over Richard's shoulder. Is that for us?" "No," Richard murmured, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. "It's for them." He watched as Audrey settled into the plush back seat of the Phantom. Before the door closed, he saw her glance up at the plane one last time. She adjusted her sunglasses, and the heavy door thudded shut, sealing her in a world Richard couldn't access. The convoy peeled away tires, crunching on the frost, disappearing toward the VIP exit gate without stopping for customs. "Okay, Mr. Dalton," the steward said, stepping aside. "You're clear to deplane." Richard stumbled down the stairs, his legs feeling heavy. At the bottom, a solitary man in a parka was holding a tablet. "Dalton," the man asked, not looking up. "Yes," Richard barked. "Where is my car? I ordered the S-Class limousine service." The man pointed to a white Mercedes van parked 50 yards away next to a luggage cart. "Transport dispatch got rerouted due to the high volume of VIPs. You're in the Sprinter. It's a shared ride with the marketing team, arriving on the next flight." "A van!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking. "I'm a keynote speaker. You expect me to show up to the Dolder Grand in a shuttle van? Take it or wait an hour for a taxi, buddy. It's Zurich during the Gala. There are no cars left." Richard looked at the van, then at Bella, who looked horrified. "I'm not getting in a van." "Rick," she hissed, "my dress will wrinkle." "Get in the damn van, Bella," Richard roared, losing his composure entirely. "Just get in." The ride to the hotel was a silent nightmare. Richard sat in the back of the Mercedes Sprinter, his knees jammed against the seat in front of him, furiously typing on his BlackBerry. He was messaging his assistant back in New York, demanding to know who Arthur was. No record of an Arthur on the shareholder list. The reply came back. Maybe a consultant. A consultant doesn't get a diplomatic escort. Richard thought, staring out the window as the dark pine forests of Switzerland blurred past. They arrived at the Dolder Grand, a castle-like hotel perched high above the city, glowing like a golden jewel against the night sky. The driveway was a procession of wealth. Ferraris, Bentleys, and Maybachs idled in line. When the Sprinter van pulled up, the valet looked confused. He didn't rush to open the door. Richard had to slide the heavy sliding door open himself, stepping out onto the red carpet with a grimace. He adjusted his tie, plastered a smile on his face, and offered his arm to Bella. "Chin up," he muttered. "Showtime, act like we own the place." They walked toward the massive revolving doors. The paparazzi were lined up behind velvet ropes, cameras poised. As Richard stepped into the light, he puffed out his chest, ready for the flashes. The photographers lowered their cameras. One of them, a man with a press pass for the Financial Times, looked at Richard, frowned, and checked a laminated sheet. "Dalton, North America?" he asked his colleague. "Yeah. Middle management," the colleague muttered. "Save the memory card." They didn't take a single photo. Richard froze. The insult was physical. It was a slap in the face. He felt Bella tense up beside him. "Rick, they aren't taking pictures. Why aren't they taking pictures? They're waiting for the board." Richard lied through his teeth, pulling her forward. "They don't shoot operations, guys. It's protocol." He reached the check-in desk for the Gala. A severe-looking Swiss woman with glasses peered over her monitor. Name: Richard Dalton, Senior Vice President. He handed over his invitation, a heavy card embossed with silver leaf. The woman scanned the QR code. The machine let out a low, dissonant buzz. Red light. She frowned and tapped her keyboard. "One moment, Herr Dalton. There is a flag on your credential." "A flag?" Richard laughed nervously. "That's impossible. I organized half the guest list for the North American sector. The seating chart was updated 10 minutes ago by the chairman's office," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You have been moved." Moved. Moved where? To the head table. She handed him a new ticket printed on standard thermal paper, not the heavy cardstock. "Table 44. It is in the gallery annex." Richard stared at the ticket. "The annex, that's the overflow room. That's where the interns and the press sit. You can't put a VP in the annex." "I do not put anyone anywhere, Herr Dalton. I follow the system. Please move aside. You are blocking the entrance for Mr. van der Hoven." Richard was shoved aside as the CEO of Dutch Airlines swept past him. He stood in the lobby, clutching the thermal ticket, feeling the foundation of his reality begin to crack. "Rick," Bella whined, tugging on his sleeve. "I need a drink. Everyone is looking at us." "They're looking because they're jealous," Richard muttered, though he knew they were looking because he was a man standing in a doorway, holding a cheap ticket, looking like he was about to vomit. "Come on," he said, grabbing her hand. "We're going to the main ballroom. I don't care what the ticket says. I'm going to find the chairman and fix this." The main ballroom of the Dolder Grand was a masterpiece of intimidation. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling, dripping light onto a sea of tuxedos and couture gowns. The air smelled of truffle oil, expensive champagne, and raw power. This was the inner sanctum of the global aviation industry. Deals that decided the fate of national airlines were made in these corners. Richard Dalton navigated the crowd like a shark that had lost its teeth. He was trying to find his rhythm, the confident swagger that usually made him the center of attention in New York. But here, the atmosphere was different. It was thicker. Every time he approached a group of executives, he knew the conversation would die down. They would turn, offer tight, polite smiles, and then physically close the circle, shutting him out. "Richard," a voice called out. Richard turned, relieved to see a friendly face. It was Bill Henderson, the VP of Logistics, a drinking buddy. "Bill." Richard exhaled, walking over. "Good to see you. You won't believe the mess at the check-in. They tried to stick me in the annex." Bill didn't laugh. He looked around nervously, swirling his drink. "Yeah, I heard about that, Rick. Look, maybe you should go to the annex." Richard's smile faltered. "What? Why?" Bill lowered his voice, leaning in. "The word is out, Rick. The restructuring memo dropped an hour ago. Rumor has it the North American leadership team is being Evaluated. Evaluated, I'm the top performer. I generated 40 million in profit last quarter. It's not about profit, Bill whispered, his eyes darting to the center of the room. It's about culture. The new ownership is purging. They're calling it a moral audit. New ownership? Richard frowned. Sterling and Company has owned us for decades. Yeah, but the silent partner, the founder, he's back. He's in the room, Rick. Bill patted Richard on the shoulder and backed away. I can't be seen talking to you right now. Sorry. Richard stood alone in the middle of the crowd. Bella had wandered off to find the bar, leaving him exposed. He needed to find the chairman, James Sterling. James would clear this up. James was his mentor. They played golf together. Richard scanned the room. The layout of the gala was hierarchical. The outer tables were for junior execs. The inner circle was for the board. And in the very center, raised on a slight platform, was the VVIP lounge, a roped-off area with white leather sofas and its own private bar. That was where James Sterling would be. Richard straightened his tie and marched toward the velvet rope. He approached the security guard. Richard Dalton, I need to speak with James Sterling. The guard crossed his arms. Invitation? I don't need an invitation to speak to my boss. Let him in. The voice came from inside the VIP area. It was James Sterling. He was standing near the railing holding a glass of wine. He looked tired, his face pale. Richard pushed past the guard. James. Thank God. You have to hear what's happening. They put me in the annex. Bill Henderson is talking about a purge, and some crazy old man my ex-wife is banging got a police escort on the tarmac. We need to get control of the narrative. James Sterling looked at Richard with a mixture of sadness and frustration. Richard, stop. Stop, James. I'm trying to save the brand. Who is this Arthur everyone is whispering about? James sighed. He turned slightly, gesturing to the main sofa in the center of the VIP area. Richard followed his gaze. Sitting on the white sofa was the old man from the plane. He had changed into a tuxedo that looked decades old, but fit him with a timeless elegance. He was sipping a ginger ale. Sitting next to him, laughing at something he had said, was the Minister of Transportation for France. Standing behind him, pouring his drink, was the CEO of Airbus, and sitting on the arm of the sofa, her hand resting protectively on the old man's shoulder, was Audrey. She looked radiant. The black jumpsuit was gone, replaced by a midnight blue gown that shimmered like the night sky. She wore no jewelry, except for a simple silver locket. Richard recognized she had worn it on their first date 20 years ago. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. James, who is that? James Sterling took a sip of his wine, his hand shaking slightly. You really don't know. You were married to his daughter for 15 years, Richard. Did you never ask about her maiden name? Pendleton. Her maiden name was Smith, Richard stammered. She told me her dad was a mechanic. She changed it to Smith when she went to college to avoid the attention, James said quietly. And her father was a mechanic in 1960, before he designed the first high-bypass turbofan engine in his garage, before he founded Pendleton Aerospace, before he bought Sterling and Company as a holding shell to manage his assets. Richard's vision blurred. Pendleton Aerospace, they supply the engines for everyone. Arthur Pendleton owns the engines, Richard. He owns the leasing company that owns our planes. He owns the airfield we landed on. He is the majority shareholder of the conglomerate that pays your salary. James looked at Richard with pity. He retired 20 years ago, became a recluse, walked away from the money to live a simple life in Ohio because he hated the sharks in the industry. He only came back today for one reason. Richard couldn't breathe. Why? He whispered. Because his daughter called him, James said. She told him she was finally free of the man who made her feel small, and she told him she wanted to take her rightful place on the board. Richard stared at Audrey. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up. The warmth she had been showing the French minister vanished instantly. Her expression became a mask of cool judgment. She leaned down and whispered something to her father. Arthur Pendleton slowly turned his head. His blue eyes locked onto Richard. He didn't smile. He simply raised his glass of ginger ale in a mock toast, then turned back to his conversation, dismissing Richard entirely. You need to leave, Richard, James said softly. The board meeting starts in 10 minutes. The first item on the agenda is a vote of no confidence in the North American leadership. You can't fire me, Richard hissed, desperation clawing at his throat. I have a contract. I have severance. Read the morality clause in your contract, Richard. Conduct unbecoming of the company values. Treating the owner like a peasant on his own jet. That's cause for termination without pay. I didn't know. Ignorance is not a defense for arrogance, a voice said behind him. Richard spun around. Audrey was standing there. Up close, the transformation was even more terrifying. The mousy, quiet woman who used to bake cookies and apologize for taking up space was gone. In her place was a queen. Hello, Richard, she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried across the VIP section. The surrounding conversations died down. Everyone was watching. Audrey, Richard choked out. Audrey, honey, let's talk about this. Outside. There is nothing to talk about, she said. You wanted a life of luxury, Richard. You wanted to climb the ladder. Well, you climbed it, and now you've reached the top. The problem is you stepped on the wrong people to get here. I was doing it for us. Richard lied, his voice rising hysterically. I worked hard for us. You worked for you, she corrected him. You treated me like an accessory. You treated my father like a nuisance. You treat your employees like numbers. She took a step closer. My father wanted to crush you, Richard. He wanted to ruin your reputation publicly. He wanted to sue you for the fraud you committed during our divorce settlement, hiding those stock options. Yes, we know about those. Forensic accountants are very thorough. Richard's knees buckled. If they found the hidden assets, he wouldn't just be followed. He would go to prison. Audrey, please! He begged, tears pricking his eyes. The room was spinning. I'm sorry, I'll make it right. My father wanted to destroy you, she repeated, but I told him no. Richard exhaled, a sob escaping his throat. Thank you. Thank you, Audrey. Don't thank me yet, she said coldly. I told him that you aren't worth the legal fees. I told him that the best punishment for a man like you isn't prison. It's irrelevance. She gestured to the security guards. Escort Mr. Dalton out, and please find his guest. I believe she is at the bar, charging champagne to a company card that has just been deactivated. 2 large guards grabbed Richard by the arms. Wait, Richard screamed, struggling as they dragged him backward. Audrey, you can't do this. I'm Richard Dalton. Not anymore, Audrey said, turning her back on him to rejoin her father. Now you're just a passenger. As Richard was hauled out of the VIP section, dragging his feet across the expensive carpet, he saw the faces of his colleagues. They weren't looking at him with sympathy. They were looking at him with relief, glad that the predator had finally been eaten by something much, much bigger. The last thing he saw before the heavy double doors swung shut was Bella screaming at a bartender who had just cut up her credit card with a pair of scissors. The revolving doors of the Dolder Grand didn't spin for Richard this time. Instead, a side door, the heavy steel exit usually reserved for deliveries and staff, was shoved open. The cold night air of Zurich hit Richard like a physical blow, stripping the warmth of the ballroom from his skin in an instant. He stumbled onto the asphalt, his patent leather dress shoes slipping on a patch of black ice. He flailed, catching himself on a dumpster, scraping his knuckles against the frozen metal. "Hey, watch the dress!" Bella shrieked behind him as she was ushered out with significantly less force, but equal finality. She was shivering violently, her arms wrapped around her exposed shoulders. The security guard, a man with a face like carved granite, tossed Richard's overcoat onto the wet ground. "You are not permitted on the premises," the guard stated, his voice flat. "If you return, the police will be called for trespassing." The heavy door slammed shut. The click of the electronic lock engaging was the loudest sound in the world. Richard stood there, panting, his breath blooming in white clouds before him. He stared at the closed door. Inside, there was music, warmth, and the life he had spent 20 years clawing his way toward. Outside, there was only the hum of the distant highway and the biting wind coming off the lake. "Fix this, Rick," Bella snapped, her teeth chattering. "I am freezing. Get the limo. Get us out of here." Richard scrambled for his coat, shaking off the grit and snow. He put it on, but the cashmere felt thin against the dropping temperature. "The limo is gone, Bella. They cancelled the account." "Then call an Uber. Call a helicopter. I don't care. Just get me to a hotel." Richard reached into his pocket for his phone. It was his company-issued BlackBerry, the device that held his entire life, his contacts, his calendar, his email, his banking apps. He pressed the power button. The screen lit up with a harsh white logo, Sterling and Company Security Protocol. Then a loading bar appeared. "Remote wipe in progress." "No," Richard whispered, tapping the screen frantically. "No, no, no." He watched helpless as the bar filled up. Deleting emails, deleting contacts, deleting wallet. Factory reset complete. The phone went black. When it rebooted, it was a blank slate, no data, no service. It was just a brick of glass and plastic. "They wiped it," Richard said, his voice trembling. "They wiped everything. I can't call a car. I can't access my contacts." Bella stared at him, her mascara beginning to run. For the first time, the look on her face wasn't annoyance. It was fear. And behind the fear, a dawning realization. "Give me your card," Richard demanded, reaching for her clutch. "Use your personal card. I'll pay you back double tomorrow." "My cards are in the hotel room," Bella cried. "I only brought my ID and the company supplementary card you gave me." Richard felt a wave of nausea. The company card Bella had been using at the bar was dead. His phone was dead. They were standing at the service entrance of a hotel, on top of a mountain in a foreign country with no local currency and no way to contact anyone. "We have to walk," Richard said, staring down the dark, winding road that led back to the city. "Walk." Bella looked at her 4-inch stilettos. "Are you insane? It's 3 miles to the train station, in these shoes." "We don't have a choice," Richard screamed, the stress finally shattering his composure. "Unless you want to sleep in that dumpster, we walk." They began the descent. It was a slow, agonizing procession. The road was lined with tall pines that blocked the moonlight, plunging them into darkness. Every few minutes, a luxury car would sweep past them, heading up to the Gala. The headlights would blind them for a second, illuminating Richard's disheveled hair and Bella's ruined makeup before leaving them in the dark again. Richard recognized the cars. He saw the CEO of Lufthansa pass in a Maybach. He saw the VP of marketing in a Bentley, people he had shared drinks with hours ago. Now he was invisible to them, just a shadow on the side of the road. About a mile down, Bella stopped. She sat on a guardrail, shivering uncontrollably. "I can't," she sobbed. "My feet are bleeding, Rick. I can't move." Richard looked at her. He wanted to feel sympathy. He knew he should. But all he felt was a burning resentment. If she hadn't been so loud, if she hadn't demanded the champagne, if she hadn't... No, a small voice in his head whispered, "This isn't her fault. It's yours." He looked at his watch, the Patek Philippe. It was the only thing of value he had left. "Come on," he said, his voice soft and defeated. "There's a gas station at the bottom of the hill. We can call a cab there. I'll give the driver my watch as collateral." Bella looked at the watch, then at Richard. "That watch is worth $50,000. "It's worth a ride to the airport," Richard muttered. "I just want to go home." It took them another hour to reach the bottom. By the time they stumbled into the fluorescent glare of the 24-hour petrol station, they looked like refugees from a destroyed kingdom. Richard's Brioni suit was stained with road salt. Bella's dress was torn at the hem. The attendant, a bored teenager, looked up from his magazine. He didn't speak English, but the universal language of desperation was clear enough. Richard unclasped the watch. He placed it on the counter. "Taxi," he pantomimed. "Airport." The teenager looked at the heavy gold watch. He looked at Richard. He smirked. He picked up the landline and dialed a number, speaking rapidly in Swiss German. 10 minutes later, a beat-up sedan with a glowing taxi sign on the roof pulled up. The driver, a large man with a thick beard, looked at the watch skeptically. "Airport?" Richard asked. The driver nodded. "Zurich Flughafen. 100 francs. "I don't have cash," Richard said, shoving the watch toward him. "Patek Philippe. Gold. $50,000. "Take it." The driver examined the watch under the street lamp. He bit his lip. He knew it was stolen, or at least that's what he assumed. A man in a tuxedo at a gas station with a crying woman. Trouble. "Okay," the driver grunted. He pocketed the watch, a lifetime of savings for a 20-minute ride, and unlocked the doors. Richard slumped into the back seat. As the car merged onto the highway, he closed his eyes. He thought of Audrey. He thought of the heated seats in the Rolls-Royce Phantom she was currently riding in. He remembered a winter 10 years ago. He had the flu. Audrey had made him soup and sat by his bed for 3 days, reading to him, changing his cool compressors. He had complained the whole time that the soup was too salty. God, he thought, tears leaking from his closed eyes. I was a monster. But the karma wasn't done with him yet. The universe had only just begun to balance the scales. The fluorescent lights of Zurich Airport's Terminal 2 were unforgiving. It was 100 a.m., the dead hour, where the only people awake were cleaners, stranded travelers, and the hopeless. Richard and Bella stood in front of the ticketing counter for Skyward Airlines, the very company Richard worked for. Or used to. "I need 2 tickets to New York. JFK or Newark doesn't matter," Richard told the night agent. He looked a wreck. His tie was missing, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his face grey with exhaustion. The agent, a young woman named Elsie, typed on her keyboard. "Passport, please." Richard handed over his passport. He didn't have his corporate ID anymore, but his passport was linked to his employee profile. He was counting on his executive platinum status to allow him to book a flight on credit, or at least use miles. He had millions of miles. Elsie scanned the passport. She paused. She frowned. She typed something else, then hit enter. A red dialogue box flashed on her screen. She looked up at Richard, her demeanor shifting from tired politeness to professional wariness. "Mr. Dalton," she said, "I'm afraid I cannot issue a ticket for you." "Why not?" Richard demanded, leaning over the counter. "Look, I know my corporate card is down. Just use my miles. I have 3 million miles in the account." "Your account has been suspended, sir," Elsie said. "It is flagged under audit. Legal hold." "Legal hold." Richard slammed his hand on the counter. "That's my personal account. They can't touch my miles." "I cannot access the funds, sir. Do you have another form of payment?" Richard turned to Bella. "Bella, call your dad." Bella looked up from her phone. She was sitting on her suitcase, charging her device at a kiosk. "My dad, Rick, my dad thinks I'm at a yoga retreat in Vermont. If I tell him I'm in Switzerland with a married man who just got fired, he'll cut me off." "We are stranded," Richard yelled. "We need tickets." "Sir, lower your voice," Elsie warned, "or I will call security." Richard took a deep breath. He dug into his wallet. He found a personal credit card, a backup visa he kept for emergencies. It had a limit of $5,000. It should be enough. "Try this," he said, sliding it across the counter. Elsie swiped it, approved. Richard exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "Thank God. 2 tickets next flight out." "The next flight is at 6 a.m., Elsie said. "However, a one-way ticket to JFK booked last minute. The price is $2,800 per seat." Richard did the math. 2 tickets would be $5,600. The card limit was $5,000. He stared at the agent. "I can only afford 1. Silence descended on the small group. The hum of the floor polisher nearby seemed deafening. Richard turned slowly to look at Bella. She was looking at him, her eyes wide. She knew the math, too. "Rick," she said, standing up. "Rick, give me the ticket." Richard looked at the woman he had destroyed his marriage for. He looked at the red dress that he had bought her, the bag he had paid for. He thought about the loyalty Audrey had shown him when they were poor, eating instant noodles in a studio apartment. And then he looked at Bella, who was already reaching for the credit card. "You have family money, Bella," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "You can call your dad. He'll yell, but he'll buy you a ticket. I have nothing. My assets are frozen. If I stay here, I'm homeless." "You brought me here," Bella screamed. "You are the man. You are supposed to take care of me." "I can't," Richard whispered. "I can't take care of anyone anymore." He turned back to the agent. "1 ticket for Richard Dalton." "You bastard!" Bella lunged at him, clawing at his face. Security was there in seconds. 2 officers pulled Bella away as she screamed obscenities that echoed through the empty terminal. "I hope you rot, Richard," she shrieked as they dragged her toward the airport police station. "I hope you die alone." Richard didn't look back. He took the boarding pass from Elsie, his hand shaking. "Gate B-12, Elsie said quietly, looking at him with undisguised disgust. "Boarding in 4 hours." Richard walked away. He went through security like a zombie. He didn't go to the Senator Lounge or the first-class club. He couldn't. He found a hard plastic row of seats near Gate B-12. He sat down, placing his empty briefcase between his legs. He was alone. Across the terminal, a janitor was changing the channel on a hanging TV screen. It switched to CNBC Global. The headline on the ticker tape caught Richard's eye. Breaking Pendleton Aerospace announces new board structure. Arthur Pendleton returns as chairman. Stock surges 15%. And then the image changed. It was a live feed from the Gala. There on the stage stood Arthur Pendleton, and next to him, holding a microphone, was Audrey. She looked powerful. She was speaking to the press, confident and poised. Richard strained to hear the audio from the overhead speakers. "We are returning to our roots," Audrey was saying. "Integrity, family, and valuing the people who actually build this company, not just the ones who take the credit." The crowd on the screen applauded. Richard saw faces in the crowd, people he had worked with for years clapping enthusiastically. They had already forgotten him. Richard looked down at his boarding pass. It wasn't first class. It wasn't business. Seat 42E, middle seat. Economy. He leaned his head back against the cold wall. A laugh bubbled up in his chest, a dry, rattling sound. He had flown to Zurich on a private jet, drinking vintage scotch, convinced he was a king. He was flying home in the middle seat of coach bankrupt single and despised wearing a dirty tuxedo. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had left from his previous life, a crumpled receipt from the airport coffee shop where he had bought a bottle of water with the last loose change in his pocket. On the back of the receipt, he saw a scribble. It was a note he had written to himself days ago when he was planning his acceptance speech. Success is the only option. Richard crumpled the paper and let it drop to the floor. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 20 years, he let himself cry. Not for the money, but for the realization that the man on the screen, the old mechanic he had sneered at, was twice the man Richard would ever be. He had taken the Mistress to the Gala, but the Mistress was gone. The wife was gone. The career was gone. The only thing remaining was the long, cramped flight home and the empty apartment waiting for him on the other side. The flight to New York was a 9-hour purgatory. Wedged into seat 42E, between a colicky toddler and a backpacker who had removed his shoes, Richard stared blankly at the seat back in front of him. There was no hot towel service. There was no scotch. There was only the low, constant hum of the engines, the same engines he realized with a bitter irony that Arthur Pendleton's company had designed. Even here in the cheap seats, he couldn't escape the man's shadow. When the plane taxied to the gate at JFK, Richard waited for everyone else to disembark. He felt a strange reluctance to step back into his life, knowing that the version of Richard Dalton, who had left New York, no longer existed. He walked into the arrivals hall, his tuxedo crumpled and stained, carrying an empty briefcase. He expected to slip away into the crowd. Instead, a man in a cheap suit stepped out from behind a pillar. "Richard Dalton." Richard nodded wearily. "Yes." The man shoved a thick envelope into his chest. "You've been served. Sterling and Company have filed a civil suit for embezzlement of company resources, and Ms. Pendleton has petitioned to reopen the divorce settlement on grounds of financial fraud. Have a nice day." The months that followed were a blur of lawyers and liquidation. The forensic accountants found everything: the offshore accounts, the undervalued stock options, the hidden bonuses. Richard didn't go to prison. Audrey, true to her word, declined to press criminal charges, but he was stripped clean. The penthouse was sold to cover legal fees. The Hamptons' deposit was forfeited. His reputation in the industry was radioactive. 6 months later, on a rainy Tuesday in November, Richard stood outside the family court in Manhattan. He had just signed the final papers, transferring his last remaining liquid assets to Audrey as restitution. As he buttoned his raincoat, A department store brand, not Brioni. He saw her. Audrey was walking down the courthouse steps. She was flanked by 2 associates reviewing a document. She looked formidable. She wasn't just the owner's daughter. She was the chairwoman of the Pendleton Foundation. "Audrey," Richard called out. His voice was cracked, desperate for some acknowledgement, some closure. She stopped. She turned slowly. Her eyes scanned him, taking in the greying hair, the tired lines around his eyes, the cheap umbrella. Richard stepped forward. I wanted you to know. I'm starting over. I'm learning." He waited for her to yell, to gloat, or perhaps to offer forgiveness. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to matter to her, even if it was as a villain. But Audrey didn't offer anger. She didn't offer forgiveness. She simply offered indifference. "Take care of yourself, Richard," she said, her voice neutral, as if speaking to a former neighbor she barely knew. She turned back to her associate. "Let's discuss the scholarship fund for the engineering program." She got into a waiting car, not a limousine, but a sensible high-end sedan, and drove away. She didn't look back. Richard stood in the rain, realizing the ultimate punishment wasn't hatred. It was being forgotten. 1 year later. "Sir, I reserved a convertible. This is a sedan." The customer was screaming, his face red, slamming his hand on the counter of the budget-right car rental desk near Newark Airport. He was wearing a flashy suit and an expensive watch. Richard Dalton stood behind the counter. He adjusted his name tag. He looked at the screaming man and saw a ghost of his former self. The arrogance, the entitlement, the belief that noise equaled power. In the past, Richard would have sneered. He would have called security. Instead, Richard took a deep breath. He smiled, a genuine, tired, humble smile. "I understand your frustration, sir," Richard said softly. "I know what it's like to expect the best and be disappointed. Let me see what I can do to fix this for you." He typed into the computer, his fingers moving rhythmically. Outside the window, a Gulf Stream jet roared into the sky, climbing toward the clouds. Richard didn't look up. He kept his eyes on the work in front of him, finally understanding that the ground was the only place where he could truly learn to stand. And so Richard Dalton learned the hardest lesson of all. You can buy the suit, you can lease the jet, and you can date the model. But you cannot buy class. True power isn't about how loudly you speak to the staff. It's about who you are when the title is stripped away. Richard thought Audrey was a stepping stone, but she was the rock he should have anchored himself to. In the end, he lost everything to find the one thing he lacked: humanity. As for Audrey, she proved that the best revenge isn't making someone pay, it's outgrowing them completely. What do you think? Did Richard deserve a harsher punishment, or was the silence from Audrey the ultimate burn? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and high-flying justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. We have a crazy tale coming up next week about a landlord who evicted a tenant only to find out she was his new boss. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching and stay humble.